be from two different perspectives. So let's move to our first talk. Our first speaker tonight is Magda Remisiewicz, and she will be talking to us from Poland, where she's an associated professor at the University of Gdansk. And she also has worked in South Africa before when she did her postdoc at the University of Cape Town. So today she will be talking about what birds have told us in 60 years of Operation Baltic. So Operation Baltic is a monitoring project about birds that occurs in Poland's Baltic coast. And in this area, birds from all over the continent, they cross this area in spring and autumn to and from the breeding grounds in the north. So thank you very much, Magda, for joining tonight, and over to you.
Okay, thank you for that nice introduction. Great. So hello, everyone from faraway Gdańsk in Poland. Well, far away from some of you and closer for some others from you, those that come from Europe. And this evening, I would like to take the opportunity to tell you a few words about the Operation Baltic, which is the longest term monitoring and research project in Poland. And this is also a citizen science project, which is focused on bird migrations, mainly on passerines. And this includes many long distance migrants between Africa and Europe, such as willow warblers, spotted flycatchers, garden warbler, that I'll mention during this talk. And we host those birds at the Polish Baltic coast on the way to or from the northern breeding grounds. So for the last 50 years, Operation Baltic has been organized by the Bird Migration Research Station at the University of Gdańsk, which I have an honor to lead for the last 8 years. And this is why I will present Operation Baltic to you tonight. So the special occasion is that we are now at the 60th anniversary year of the Operation Baltic. So it's actually bit older than me. So on that special occasion, we try to summarize some outcomes of this long-term field research project. So I'd like to use that opportunity tonight to present to you what we've achieved in studies of bird migrations over those years. And this will be just few glimpses from the result of the Operation Baltic team, which I just chose from a load of data and results this research project has generated over the past 60 years. And for the past 60 years, bird ringers, bird watchers, volunteers, citizen scientists, anyone that has slight interest in bird migrations have been meeting at the Polish Baltic coast each spring and autumn with a common purpose to study and to monitor bird migrations. And the conditions back in the 1960s have been quite basic, as you see here. Also, the photos were black and white, and the equipment was, quite basic, as you see from that scale. And now, recent years, the conditions have slightly improved, and maybe we've got slightly more sophisticated equipment, but the spirit remained the same. It's mostly about studying the phenomenon of the bird migration and trying to learn as much about this as we can with the main methods applied, such as mist netting and ringing of the birds. But nature technology advances and there are new methods invented. So over the decades, we've been also involving other methods, but all in the common purpose to study and monitor bird migrations. So the first question might be, why is it specifically the Baltic coast from all over, the beautiful places all over Poland that could be good for bird watching? So the answer is brought to you by that map, which presents the main migration routes of passerines and also of other land birds between Europe and Africa within the so-called Euro-African bird migration system. And if you have a closer look at the Polish Baltic coast, which is the little frame here, then you can see that the blue and the red lines cross here. And what does it mean? It basically means that the populations of migrants that use Western Africa or Southwestern Europe as their non-breeding grounds migrate towards the breeding grounds at the north along the Baltic coast. but also those birds that spend the non-breeding season in Southeastern Africa, Eastern Africa, Middle East, and the Balkans. They also migrate in spring to their breeding grounds across the Baltic coast. So as you see, those two red and blue lines that show those migration routes cross on the Baltic coast, which makes that Baltic coast of Poland a very special place to study bird migrations, because at any time of spring or autumn migration, it supports dense stream of numerous migrants of many species, which is an interesting research situation and great opportunity to monitor those migrants. Well, this is also the reason of our headache, you know, while analyzing this data, because we've got a mixture of the two main streams of migrants, which makes the interpretation of the results more difficult than in other places in Europe. But we try to make the good use of those locations. So basically, the two stations that operate now in spring season is Bukowo in central coast of Poland and Hel, located at Hel Peninsula, because those two stations then are perfectly located on the stream of migration that goes from somewhere from southwest of Europe towards the breeding grounds in northeastern Europe. While during autumn migration season, then the migration goes in the opposite direction, then that station, Mierzeja Wiślana, is better location for the stream of migrants that goes towards the southwest or inland towards southeast. So in autumn, we change that location at the north of Gdańsk Bay to Mierzeja Wiślana, the location at the south of Gdańsk Bay, but we keep Bukowo location the same because it's also on the migration flower of the birds going to southwest. And also Bukowo is on those crossroads for the birds that are crossing through the Baltic. So it's a perfect location, especially with that location of the island of Bornholm, which is a great stopover place for tired migrants. Then we host a lot of migrants from and to Sweden. So basically right now this week, Bukowo station and Hel have been opened. And one other reason while we study the bird migrations on the coast, and we've got such great numbers, is also that the coastline is the leading line for the migrants that basically provides them orientation cue during migration. And then the peninsulas, such as Hel or here Vistula Spit, are sort of narrow corridors that also channelize the bird migration, which makes them easier to catch by mist nets set up perpendicularly to the migration stream. So then catching high numbers of migrants is much easier than anywhere in inland. And this is what makes the Polish Baltic and those three places so special. So basically those locations have been discovered as ideal places to study bird migration by the first teams in 1961. And they have operated every spring and autumn season since then until present, until the current spring. So this is how the Operation Baltic looks like almost today, meaning a couple of days ago. This is the first day of operating for the station Hel. So this is the current setup. This is the ringing station, the main ringing tent, which is also joined with a kitchen. And then here bedrooms scattered over the forest. And I would like to drive your attention to that little chimney here with some smoke, which means that the stove is operating, which is quite an important luxury considering the temperatures that can still go down at mornings and evenings to around 0. So at that stage, we mostly have only short and medium distance migrants. And the first bird ringed this spring at Hel was this beautiful male bullfinch. And then it was followed by a couple of other common migrants, such as grey tits, for which it's already a half or actually the second half of migration now. Then robins that are on their way back from the wintering grounds in the Mediterranean, and dunnocks, which are early migrants as well. Now, the other birds, the passerines that you know from Africa, will start coming a little bit later in April and May, because they've got a longer distance to cover. So they'll appear at the Baltic coast a bit later than those birds that arrive from close areas. And then over the 6 years of Operation Baltic, having this amazing opportunity of handling thousands of birds every season, various kinds of data have been collected in a monitoring manner. So the first main type of data was the data from ringing, but recently also from other devices that were used to determine the bird migration routes, the migration routes of the migrants that we host at the Baltic Sea, to learn about their breeding grounds and the non-breeding grounds. Once we know the migration routes of the migrants, and having 6 years of data in hand, we could actually attempt to analyze whether there are any effects of any climate change over the decades on the timing of the bird migrations. With several decades of monitoring data, we could also analyze the multi-year changes in the numbers of migrant birds, especially for the common migrants. And this will be the three aspects of our data and our output that I would like to target in that presentation. Otherwise, I could talk to you for many hours and we'd stay awake for the whole night. Besides this type of data, while ringing the birds, we very meticulously collect morphometric data. So each ringed migrant is also measured, and we take a set of at least 13 measurements from each migrant, and it might be a couple more for certain species for which we've got specially designed research projects. And this data is now collected in our huge databases. So basically, over the 60 years of Operation Baltic, we ringed more than 2 million birds. And then for most of those 2 million birds, we've got at least 13 measurements for each bird. So you can only imagine, you can quickly calculate how many biometric records do we have in our databases. This is a little bit overwhelming, but we are nearly at the final stages of digitizing all the data back from 60s. And this database altogether is actually the largest database of biometry of any land animals that is available in the world. Besides checking morphometrics of the migrants, and then recent years, we also tried to analyze how the biometrics of the birds might have changed over the years. We also assessed the migrants' condition, which adds additional information. Now, since 2013, I introduced to our station assessment of the molt patterns for migrants. And this is thanks to Les and thanks to his teaching me or involving me with the molt analysis that I found that topic interesting and actually quite applicable to the migrants close to their breeding grounds, because many of European migrants molt after the breeding season close to their breeding grounds before they set out for migration. So this data has been collected since 2013, so we are getting nice data sets by now. For some years, also directional experiments have been conducted at our stations, which were experiments in sort of orientation cages that the birds were kept for about 10 minutes. And they had the chance to show their directional preferences. After that, the birds were released, but we stayed with the results showing which direction the birds wanted to migrate. And then it's also interesting data that contributes or supplements our knowledge about the bird migration routes. We've been using also other techniques, such as DNA sexing of the migrants, in which you cannot tell the males from the females. And this helps to analyze sex differential migrations of those monomorphic species. Now, having the opportunity to handle lots of birds, we set up a nice collaboration with parasitologists, and there have been a couple of studies on bird parasites. And there is many other types of material that is stored in our field notebooks and databases, like visual observations of passage that have been conducted for a couple of decades. the data of migration dynamics that is possible to derive from the numbers of ringed birds, and many other aspects of research on migrating birds have been conducted, but they've always been combined with outreach, promotion, and education about the phenomenon of bird migrations and about the value of the migrant birds to us humans as a part of our environment. And we educate where, at normal times, we've been inviting different age groups to our ringing stations. There have been special events promoting bird migrations. We hosted school groups and seniors group and loads of volunteers. Well, recently, over the recent years, we mostly relied on TV and radio broadcasts, but we still keep promoting bird migrations. So talking about migration routes of birds, which is the basic knowledge before you study anything else, then the main method of studying bird migrations since 1961 have been ringing. So those 2 million of birds have been ringed, and some of them, rather tens or hundreds for any single species, have given any ringing recoveries. And maybe each year those recoveries are a few, but over the 6 years combined for a certain species, then they provide reasonable data set that can tell us something about the migration routes of that species. And technology develops. So since 2015, we started fitting some selected migrants with geolocators. And we've been not fitting geolocators on the birds on passage, because then this would be very difficult to retrieve the data from those geolocators. But we fitted geolocators on the birds breeding in the vicinity of our ringing stations. And this already brought some interesting information. So to summarize or show the example of some output from ringing recoveries that can be collected over the decades. This is an example of my own PhD on migrations of robins, which was based on analysis of ringing recoveries of that species, ringed on migration in our 3 Polish stations, but this data was not enough yet for any deeper analysis, but all the other stations on the Baltic coast from other countries have kindly provided me with the data on robins, which altogether made a data set of more than 1,100 of ringing recoveries of robins that have been ringed anywhere around the Baltic and recovered elsewhere during their migrations or at their wintering grounds. And as you see, robin is a medium distance migrant that only goes as far as northern Africa. But thanks to that load of ringing recoveries, I was able to figure out that robins actually use 4 well-defined migration routes to get to their wintering grounds, which was the Atlantic route along the coast, European coasts of Atlantic through Iberian Peninsula, and the furthest migrants on that flyway got to northern Africa, to Morocco. Then there was another distinct and later group of migrants that migrated along the northern slopes of Alps to the Mediterranean region, and some of them cross the Mediterranean Sea. Then another group of migrants migrated south of the Alps or across the passages in Alps. And some of them, many of them stayed for wintering in Italy, but some also crossed the Mediterranean Sea and ended up in Algeria and Tunisia for wintering. And the 4th very distinct group, indicated by much fewer recoveries because of low recovery rates in that region, but still that small group clearly indicated that there is some migration direction that goes from the Baltic coast towards the southeast to the Balkans and Middle East, where a part of our robins also spend their winter. So this study was possible only because of collaboration of all the Baltic stations, which then shows the value of the combined effort and a good collaboration instead of competing while you collect similar kind of data. Now, examples for other species. Robin is actually one of our top 5, and this explains why we had so many ringing recoveries. Other species are less common, so also the ringing recoveries are less common. But when we combine them from all the decades, then they provide some pattern. So, for example, pied flycatchers that we host in spring and autumn at the Polish Baltic coast originate from Scandinavia, mostly here from Skane and from Finland, but also somewhere from northwestern Russia and the Baltic states. And in autumn on migration, they migrate mostly to southwest as far as to northwestern Africa. But this single ringing recovery probably is an evidence that some of those pied flycatchers might also migrate through the Balkans somewhere to the southeast. For spotted flycatcher, the ringing recoveries are even fewer, but they are meaningful. So they show that the spotted flycatchers that we catch and ring at the Baltic coast, they originate from Scandinavia, somewhere from Finland, but they choose altogether different migration routes, like migrating south through the Apennine Peninsula or through the Balkan towards their non-breeding grounds in sub-Saharan Africa. And those 2 ringing recoveries come from Congo, DRC, and these are the furthest ever records of the birds ringed at the Operation Baltic. And the recent results from geolocators that were fitted on blackcap at Bukovo Station and another neighboring location showed very interesting patterns about the migrants. Actually, we have done this study in collaboration with Max Planck Institute from Germany, and our data on the black caps from our stations have been combined with data on black caps with geolocators fitted in a couple of other places in Europe, including the UK. And what happened is that when the patterns for all those black caps from the tracks were combined, it showed an interesting thing. So most of black caps from Western Europe and even most of black caps from our Polish locations migrated to the well-known southwestern non-breeding grounds in Iberian Peninsula or northwestern Africa. But there is another well-known migration direction for black caps from a little bit eastern part of Europe. A part of our black caps, which we know from ringing recoveries, also migrates to the Balkans and then towards the southeast, somewhere to the Middle East, as far as to East Africa. But those birds were just not represented among the birds that were retrieved with geolocators, but that green fraction, the green birds, showed a very interesting pattern, like intermediate migration direction, intermediate migration route. And this was so for some 1/3 of the black caps with geolocators from our Polish stations, and also about the same proportion for the black caps from central Austria. And this was explained by the German colleagues by the fact that those stations are located on a migratory divide, which is like the contact zone between different migratory populations, which is the populations that use different wintering grounds and use different migration routes, but that meet somewhere at the breeding grounds. And then at the contact zone, there is some hybridization occurring, and those hybrids probably express the intermediate migration direction, which is the effect of the mixed genes with the 2 migration programs. So this study carries on. There have been those first very promising results that have been recently published. And this is how a single track from our black cap looks like. So out of 35 black caps that we fitted with the geolocators, we are able to retrieve 11 during 5 years, and we already have this interesting information. The study carries on. We are still fitting black caps with the geolocators and waiting for them to return and bring us new information about their migrations. Now I mentioned that we made some use of the 60 years of data, trying to figure out the trends in numbers of migrants that we observe at our Operation Baltic stations, in anticipation that those trends will also reflect the general trends of the populations breeding north and northeast of our stations. So here are the long-term trends for black caps from our stations, from the 2 stations and autumn and spring season. And the racing trends basically indicate that black caps seemingly are doing well, and they probably have benefited from climate warming, similarly to many other forest birds in Europe. So basically the numbers of breeding black caps increase all over Europe, and this is reflected in those increasing trends. Similarly for the European robin, also the population trends are going up. So generally the breeding rabbits have benefited from climate warming, and this has been reflected by those increasing trends, especially after the 1990s at all our stations. But the situation with the willow warblers, the long distance migrants from Africa, is not so great. Because basically what we observed over the 6 decades of the Operation Baltic is rather decreasing trend. And unfortunately, this decreases trend reflects a decrease of the numbers of that species in most Europe, especially in Western Europe. But the populations of willow warbler from more Eastern Europe and in Scandinavia, fortunately, are increasing in recent decades. And we can see the reflection of that in the spring numbers of willow warblers passing through the Bukovo station, which have increased since the 90s. And we believe that this effect of the slightly increasing trend is actually the result of the mixture of those populations that arrive to the Baltic coast from the southwest and from the southeast, and mix at the Polish Baltic coast. So we think that the eastern population is doing better, and hence that slightly increasing trend. Now, talking about willow warblers as a long distance migrants, I would like to show you some recent results that we produced with Les that show the influence of climate change of timing of willow warblers spring migration as we observe it at our station Bukovo. So from ringing recoveries, we basically know that the Baltic coast hosts 2 subspecies of willow warbler, the nominate subspecies that uses non-breeding grounds in Western Africa and then migrates to the breeding grounds in Scandinavia along that western route. But also willow warblers that spend a non-breeding season in southeastern and eastern Africa migrate through the more eastern route again to the breeding ground in Scandinavia and more to the east, and they also appear on the Polish Baltic coast. So together with Les, we actually set out to check how would the different conditions, different environmental conditions that those willow warbler experience at different stages of their life that they spend in all those different locations, how would those climate indices affect the spring migration of the willow warblers that we observe at Bukovo. And we use the data set, and we use the set of 13 climate indices from the breeding grounds, from the migration routes, but also from the non-breeding grounds in Africa as the proxies for the environmental conditions, such as rainfall and temperatures that willow warblers can experience during their life cycle, during the year preceding the spring migration at Bukovo. And what we found out, well, the first result was that over the 36 years that Bukovo station operated in spring, the migration of willow warblers at Bukovo in spring advanced by more than 5 days on average. And this was rather an obvious result, which we expected, because this agrees with such trends observed for willow warblers all over Europe and also for other long distance migrants. So this result was not surprising. But what was the most surprising of the whole analysis was that the climate index that had the greatest effect on the timing of spring arrivals of willow warblers at Bukovo was not the local spring temperatures or any climate or weather conditions that the willow warblers experience in spring in Europe. It was actually the climate indices that reflected the conditions that the willow warblers experience while they stay in Eastern and Southeastern Africa, namely the Indian Ocean Dipole, which is a climate index that reflects the rainfall in Eastern and Southeastern Africa. So the high was the Indian Ocean Dipole, which indicates high rainfall. And the previous August to October, the earlier willow warblers arrived in spring half a year later at our station at Bukovo. And this was the strongest effect of all the climate indices that we observed. And this was the striking result. How does it work? So this effect was pronounced in some years, like those years that are marked here in red, which were the years with high Indian Ocean dipole, which then reflects high rainfall in East and Southeastern Africa. And in those years where the pink points were high, which means the high value of the Indian Ocean Dipole Index, willow warblers were observed at Bukovo early. And those years that are marked here in blue were years of low Indian Ocean Dipole, as shown here by the low values of this pink curve. And in those years, willow warblers occurred at Bukovo late. So there was some clear effect of the Indian Ocean Dipole through the effect on rainfall in Africa that determined spring arrivals of willow warblers to Bukovo. We also analyzed those other climate indices, expecting that also conditions at the breeding grounds might affect willow warblers migration. And yes, the conditions in Scandinavia, the previous breeding season, also had some effect on the timing of willow warblers migration at Bukovo. Basically, the higher was the Scandinavian index, which indicates warm and dry conditions in Scandinavia during the willow warblers breeding period. Then the earlier willow warblers arrived in spring at Bukovo in spring, like about 10 months later. So there was really like carryover effect of what happened at the breeding grounds. Now, we also analyze how would the local conditions during that spring migration affect the timing of that spring passage. And to our surprise, the effect was weak. The effect of local temperatures at weather station Weba, located not far from Bukovo, had some but rather weak effects on willow warbler spring passage. Basically, the warmer was April and May. At the Polish coast, the earlier was spring migration of willow warblers, but it wasn't very strong effect. Now, because the results were so striking and interesting, then over the last years, together with Les, we've been digging more and trying to learn even more, squeeze out even more of those decades of that on willow warblers. And what we found that the effect of those climate indices of willow warbler migration at Bukovo changed over the spring season. So basically, the willow warblers that arrived at the beginning of the spring season at Bukovo were mostly under influence of those climate indices, the Indian Ocean Dipole and the Southern Oscillation Index, that operate far away in Africa and mostly in Southern and Southeastern Africa, and they reflect the rainfall there. And later during spring season, other cohorts of willow warblers were more affected by the Sahel Precipitation Index, which operates in the Sahel zone of Western and Central Africa, and then by the Northern Oscillation Index that could affect those willow warblers on their way from Western Africa towards Bukovo. So our interpretation of those results is those changing effects of those climate indices indicated the sequential passage of those different subspecies of willow warblers. I mean, the brownish south species, the brownish subspecies from more eastern non-breeding grounds that actually goes to more eastern breeding grounds. And then the nominative, the greenish subspecies, Phylloscopus trahilus, that migrates from the non-breeding grounds in Western Africa through Western Europe and then arrives at Bukovo and then actually goes to the breeding grounds only in the Western skein. And here there is migratory divide between those two subspecies. So this is a very complex pattern, and as I showed you, this exactly indicates the complicated crossroads situation we've got here at the Operation Baltic, but we try to do the best use of the 6 years of data. So to summarize the willow warbler story, the question is, why would ever the climatic conditions far away from the Baltic coast and operating months earlier influence the timing of spring migration of willow warblers or any other migrants at our Operation Baltic field stations? And this is our explanation on how this effect could work. So basically, in Africa, it is more the rainfall than temperature that affects the food availability, especially the insects, which is important for insectivorous birds, such as willow warblers. So if the austral summer is wet, then there will be lots of insects, which is great food abundance for those migrants. So then the migrants will be able to survive the non-breeding season in pretty good shape. And then they would be ready for the departure on spring migration early and in good condition, having deposited good fuel stores for that long distance migration. Now, if on top of that, they encounter warm spring on migration routes at the stopovers, then again, they will be able to refuel and recover quickly and then cross longer distances without stops, so the migration will be altogether fast. And those effects combined will result in early spring arrival and generate early spring migration of willow warblers or other migrants through our Operation Baltic stations. And what it shows that in organisms with such tight annual schedules as migratory birds and especially long distance migrants, the carryover effect of changes in one life stages causes the domino effect in the following stages of their life. And this is one of the aspects of the birds' migrations that we've been able to discover using the 60 years of data. And if you'd like to get more information about our current activities, then I invite you to our Facebook page and Instagram that has current relations, current news about what's going on at the ringing stations, and more general information about our activities and results you can find at our websites that also are provided in English. So I welcome you there. And then thank you for your attention today. I think I've already exceeded my time, but that talk will be continued next week. So if you still have strength and you want to hear more about other long distance migrants, then join us next Wednesday evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Magda. That was great. I think it's really nice seeing that for how long have been running this monitoring program and how many results you can have from analyzing that you can have long-term studies and you can understand so many aspects of the migration of birds. So that was great. Well, I see there is a couple of questions in the chat. Mm-hmm. So there's one from Ekpa, and he's asking if they feed on insects along the route, that he's wondering if there is a relationship in their migration and the Pantala flavescens, which is a dragonfly that has a very long migration.
Oh, okay. Well, I don't know about any relation with any dragonfly. my sense is that dragonflies might be a bit too big as for little willow warbler, which is like 8-gram birds. I think he'll only eat sort of mahis and kind of mosquito type of birds, mosquito types of insects and midges. But definitely willow warblers will have on the insects along their route because they're insectivores. I don't think they feed in flight like barn swallows, but they will basically, at stopovers, when they stop, they will collect insects from vegetation. This is how they usually feed also at the stopovers at our Baltic stations. So I think they would do more or less the same at all other stopovers. Although I haven't seen them at any other stopovers, I've seen them in South Africa and they were doing the same. They were basically picking insects from the vegetation. So I don't know if there would be any relationship the migration to the Pantella flavescens, but clearly there would be some relationship of the migration to the small insects abundance.
So I think David also asked a question, but I think you already answered in your talk. It was about if the climate indices are having a direct effect on willow warbler migration timing, for example, food availability and body condition, or it was, or do you think they are using these climate indices as cues to select the best time for migration?
Yeah, I think my sense, and from what I read in the literature, it's rather the effect through food and then body condition. And such effects have been described for other Philoscopus species in India, that, there were direct studies over the couple of non-breeding seasons. Then during very wet non-breeding season with good food abundance, they were the other Philoscopus, the Eastern Philoscopuses, were ready for departure early, in good condition, they departed early. So I think a similar pattern would apply to our willow warblers. I think that the better cue for departure is rather than changing photoperiod that would change in Africa as well as it does in Europe in autumn. But I think when the birds are in good condition, after a wet non-breeding season, I think they'll be ready to depart. This is my sense.
Okay, thank you very much, Magda. And as Magda said before, Magda's talk was just one part. So next Citizen Scientist Hour will be next Wednesday, 7th of April. And Magda will be one of our speakers.